Hey everyone, this is Scott from Pomerol. Today in this short video, I'm going to walk through a typical use case of how to install the Writeback extension for Qlik SaaS and how to set up a typical use case in a Qlik SaaS application. So the first thing you need to do is actually get the latest version of Pomerol's Writeback extension into your SaaS environment. So the way to do that is head across to pomerolpartners.com. If you jump up to the menu on the top right and go to Qlik Writeback, you can fill in a few details on the web form here, just name, company, and email, and we will email across a download link to get your version of the latest extension. What you're going to want to do once you've downloaded that is there'll be a password in the email that you'll need to use to unzip the package. So unzip the package and then zip it back up without a password. Then what you can do is navigate across to your SaaS console. If you go to extensions and then go to add, you can then drag that zipped package into the console and get that extension loaded up here. In order to do this, you'll need to be a tenant admin in the Qlik SaaS environment. And it's important to make sure that that zipped package that you're dragging in here is not password protected so that Qlik can actually read the contents. So once you have that extension imported into your SaaS environment. You can go into any application, go into edit mode, head across to the custom objects library, and you should see that extension object under Pomerol Writeback. So that's the first step. We've got the extension in our SaaS environment. So the use case that we're setting up today is related to scenario modeling of sales opportunities. So we've got a sales opportunity data set coming from Salesforce, and we're visualizing that sales opportunity pipeline in a typical Qlik application like this. And what we're trying to do here is a sales team would use this to model what if scenarios. So they want to do things like take an opportunity, for example, let's grab one of these, and they want to say, what would be the impact on my sales pipeline if my materials revenue amount was boosted by 30K? Maybe the close date of this opportunity is pushed out a month. What impact is this going to have on my overall pipeline? So that's the use case here. Now, there's a couple of important things to note. If I open up the Writeback extension again, so in our source data set coming from Salesforce, we have these labor and materials amounts. So what we're trying to do with the Writeback extension is we're almost creating an alternative record for this opportunity ID that contains these updated amounts. So you can imagine in the underlying data model, we've now got two rows of data. We've got the original row that's coming out of Salesforce, and now we have a new row that has these updated values in it. So that's one part of our use case is creating an alternative record of a value that already exists in our source data set. The other thing that we're doing in here is when a sales rep comes in here and creates one of these scenario modeling versions, we might want them to add some comments in here to explain why they've modeled this opportunity to be pushed out a month, for example. Now, this comments field, this does not exist in Salesforce, and it does not exist in our source data set. So this is a slightly different scenario that we also need to cater for in our planning, and I'll show you how we do that. So if I put the application into edit mode, and our extension is up here in the top right hand corner. Now, I'm just going to look at some of the front end configuration, and that'll help understand and sort of explain why we're setting up the load script the way that we are. So the first section in here is dimensions, and these fields here that you choose, these are the fields in this order that you want to appear in the editing window when you open the Writeback extension. Um, Now, in order to add a field in here for editing, you can imagine when it was something like the materials revenue. This is in our source data set. And so, the materials revenue is in this sales opportunities table. So we can simply look for that field and say we want this to be in our kind of editing data set. But when it comes to something like comments, remember, this field does not exist in our source data set. So in order for it to be available here as a dimension that we can actually select, it needs to be in memory. So one of the first things we need to do to set up sort of the base of our use case is we want to take our base data set as it exists today, whether it's coming from Excel, coming from Salesforce, coming from anywhere. We need to make sure that if there's new fields that we want to capture, we need some placeholders so that we have these fields in memory so that when we come to configure the front end, they're actually available to select as dimensions. So that's just an important note here around how to cater for that use case where you've got fields that you want the user to edit that don't exist in your underlying data set. Now, I've created these new 4 fields in this single table, but there's no reason why I couldn't have created these in a separate table and used this opportunity ID as the key and had essentially a separate table off the side here that contained just my edits and linked on the opportunity ID. For simplicity, what I'm doing is I'm actually just creating a single table in my data model. And every time I create a new scenario for one of these opportunity IDs, I'm essentially creating a new row of data that just gets appended. So this sales opportunities table is just going to grow and grow and grow with every new scenario that I build. So if I jump back to the front end here, I'm just going to look at a couple of these fields just to show you how some of the configuration works. So one of the things that's really important is I need to have a key so that when we go and edit a record, so if I pop open the extension again, when I go and apply these edits, Qlik needs to know how can I associate these edits back to the source record that they relate to. So you need to have a key as part of your use case for this. So if we go to the first dimension here, what you'll see here is you've got these different toggles that tell the extension how to treat this field. And so this first one here, we're saying, yes, this is the primary key. We want it to be visible in the editing window. We want to be able to write this field back. So we want it to be part of our file of data that gets stored every time we do a write back. So that's kind of what these different toggles are doing. Now we've got this one toggle here called field in database, and what this is doing is um, if we need to put a calculated dimension in here, um, what we then need to do is say, look, this here is not actually the field name that you should be looking for in the database. We need to sort of tell the extension that, hey, we've actually input a calculated dimension here, and you should ignore this string. And this is actually the field name that we want you to store this as when you store these edits. And this process will come a little bit more clear once we get a little bit further on. But essentially, what the setting here is allowing you to do is create any calculated dimension you want, but then say, hey, when you store this, just call it op ID. So if we go down to another one of these fields, and so you'll have this set of settings or parameters against each of these dimensions. So the first one was our key, and then the next field here is labor. So this is one of the fields that exists in our source data set, and it's one that we want to be able to edit in our editing experience here. So we've found the field in our in-memory model. We've given it a label, and then we've said, look, it's not the primary key. We want it to be visible. We want to write it back to the database. We don't necessarily need to write it back to the database. We might just want to see the labor amount in our editing window, but it's really just supporting information, and we might have no need to actually store this value every time we do a write back. What down here we've said we want this to be editable. And so once we say this is editable, you then get another set of options. And the most important piece here is what type of edit would you like? So we've chosen this to be an input box where someone can just enter a value that they choose. But in some other scenarios, like setting a status, for example, you would want to create a drop down box, like a drop down menu of predefined values. And some of the other options in here, we've got a normal kind of date picker. We've got a checkbox that's like a binary true false type of edit. That's how the data is stored in the background. We've got a text area for capturing sort of larger comments, so that the input box would be for capturing sort of one word or a numeric value. The text area would be for capturing some commentary or narrative or a full sentence. So we've chosen the edit type, and then we've also set this data type to numeric. And the reason we've done this is that we're asking someone to edit the labor amount here. So we don't want them to go and enter a name or a word. We want them to enter a numeric value. So we're actually forcing this to only accept numeric characters. So the first sort of key step to setting up your use case is to go and select these fields from your in-memory data model and choose how we want these to be treated during the editing experience. And so we get all the way down to the end here, and that's, we've got about a dozen fields in here. Now the I think the important thing to note here is that there's a lot of flexibility, but the key thing that matters is you need to have a key. And then for each of these fields, you need to choose whether you just want this value presented as part of the editing experience, but it doesn't actually get saved to the database and the user can't update it, or whether you want the field to truly be editable. And so that's what all those sort of on-off toggles are doing, is saying, like, how do you want the user experience to work when this field is presented in the editing window? Um, Something else you can do is add measures. So you can imagine in this scenario, we might have labor and materials, and we might be adjusting maybe like a discount percentage. So then what you can do in this measures here is actually add a calculation. Um, so you could have something like a gross margin value. These measures are always going to appear as the columns on the far right. We do have a development backlog item to let you actually be able to intersperse the measures in between the dimensions, but that's currently not available. So any measures that you set up here, just note that these will be on the far right-hand side of the editing window. The next piece here is just some configuration around the button layout. So, you can set a color. We can put a label on the button. The label can be a calculation. So you might want this to be conditional, like when someone selects a particular sales op, you might want this to say update sales op 10427. So you can make this dynamic. Uh, Something else that's really important is you can create a condition for the button. So you might have certain scenarios where you only want the user to be prompted to make an edit under certain conditions. Like maybe I don't want to prompt someone to update a sales op until they have selected one sales op. That'd be a pretty typical calculation condition. Um, in some use cases, I've seen people using the calculation condition here to actually restrict the editing experience to only a subset of users of the app. Um, this was not really created as a security feature, but it can be used quite effectively to say, I've got 100 users and 10 of them are part of this user group, and only where the user is part of this group should we show them the button that prompts them to go and edit. So there's some other configuration options in here. I'm not going to go through all of these, but um, these are really things like when the editing window pops up on the screen, like where do you want it to be positioned on the page? Um, what message do you want displayed after a write back edit has been made? Things like the title that's in the editing window. um, we by default the write back extension appears as a pop-up, so the standard presentation is that you have a button somewhere on the screen. The button is conditional and only shows based on your conditions when you want it to show. And when the user clicks it, it opens up an editing window that can then be maximized or dragged around the page. But it is possible to turn this into an inline editing experience. And that's a slightly different configuration. But what you then do is the editing window is effectively a table of data that's permanently on the page. And so there's no pop-up experience. But we're not going to look at that type of setup today. We'll deal with that in another tutorial. Okay, so one of the other pieces in here that's really important is this piece around sort of the configuration or the file that we actually want to write data back to, and the credentials that are being used. So the first thing to think about here is that because we're in Qlik SaaS, we don't really have the concept of a service account in Qlik SaaS. So as a user, I'm currently authenticated in this browser session. And so when I go and do a write back, Qlik is sort of processing that write back as me, as my user account that I'm currently logged in as. Now, if I only have an analyzer license, typically I wouldn't be able to do a write back because my analyzer session is not allowed to reload applications. So what you can do here is if you want to simulate a situation where you have a service account actually processing your writebacks, and essentially this is relevant where maybe you want to release this to users that only have an analyzer license and wouldn't normally have the rights to reload applications. What you can do is you can take one of your power users who has a professional license, generally someone who's like a tenant admin, for example, and you would get them to generate an API key when logged in as their account, and we would actually paste that API key into this window. And what this is going to do is when John from the sales team logs in with his analyzer license, it's going to tell the extension to don't try and process this right back as John with his analyzer license. I want you to overwrite the credentials that are being used for authentication and actually use the API key that is associated with our tenant admin, for example. So this is how we are sort of bypassing the issue around an analyzer license holder not being able to initiate a partial reload of the application. Um, so the next piece in here that's really important is every time we hit save and do a write back, we need to store that data to somewhere. So we're in Qlik SaaS here. And one of the things that keeps this whole workflow really simple is that we're not connecting to different databases and we're not leaving the Qlik SaaS environment whatsoever. So the application that we're working in is published. I've got it published into this writeback extension space here. And then when I do a write back, I want to store my edits and I can choose the file type. So I'm storing these into a QVX file and I'm saying I want these to be stored into my writeback extension space. So literally what's going to happen here is every time I go and update or edit one of my sales ops, I'm going to go like this and hit save. And then what's going to happen is that a QVX file of those edits is going to be written to this space. So if we actually go and look for our data files in this space, um, what we'll see here is we've got this QVX. It was just updated a few seconds ago. And this file here, if we actually go and preview what's in this file, what we should see is one record of data. And that was the record that we just went and updated here. We just changed that probability to 40. So it's really important to understand this workflow here around what's happening when we click save. So the QVX file, every time you hit save, that file is being overwritten. So you can imagine like it's got one record here. If we go and maybe we go and make some updates to some other sales ops, we can edit more than one record at a time, obviously. So if we go and update these 4 records, and maybe we apply, oh, we haven't got bulk editing turned on. Okay, so maybe we go and change some of these close dates and change some of these probabilities and change the status of this. What's going to happen here is that QVX is just going to get overwritten again. So if we jump out of here, and then if we open up our preview again, we should see those 4 records in the QVX file this time. So it's important to know how this works, because when we go and make our updates to the load script shortly, we need to accommodate the fact that the QVX file is only ever grabbing the latest edits from the latest writeback operation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump back in here, and then I'm going to go into the load script so we can start seeing how to set this up in the load script now. So we've got our base QVD file here. We created this from our original data set. I was getting it from Excel. It could have been from Salesforce. We chatted about how some of these fields are existing fields that we want to create alternative records for, but we also wanted to create some new fields that aren't in the source data source, and we needed to create placeholders for those. And then we also chatted about how we've got these 2 fields that are almost metadata fields that the writeback extension is capturing every time on its own. We don't need to do anything to set this up, but what I'm doing when I set up my base QVD in the first place, I'm kind of setting up these 2 placeholders here, and I'm just throwing in some values just to indicate that, hey, this was the original data set uploaded by Scott Duffy, on this date. So just more for consistency purposes here, I'm creating some metadata that can come along with the original set of records. So once I've created this script here, I like to just kind of label it, explain what I'm doing, and then I'll just push this down to the very end. I'll retain this, and the reason is that tomorrow there might be a new use case where someone says, hey, we want to capture one more field. Can you go and update this application? So I might need to actually come here and recreate my base QVD during this development process as we sort of work out our use case and get everything built. So definitely retain this script and just push it to the back. So now we're going to look at the main script and just go through the workflow. So I've got my base QVD that I've created here. So the first key piece here is we need to load this into memory. So this QVD file, at the moment, all this contains is our original data set from Salesforce. It doesn't contain any edits yet, but every time we make a writeback edit, we're going to append it to this QVD. So the first step in the chain here is to load this QVD into memory. The next thing we're going to do, and remember this script here, every time we hit save on the writeback, Qlik is going to initiate a partial reload. Now, in this use case, when we run a partial reload, we're actually effectively running the entire script. And our data model is extremely simple, but you can imagine another scenario where maybe we have these accounts and they also have historical transactions. So maybe out here on the side, we actually have a transactions table that has 20 million rows in it. So the reason we want to initiate a partial reload is that we only want to recreate this one table in the data model, the sales opportunities table. If we had that large table of transactions, we want that to stay where it is, and we obviously don't want to have to reload that every time we save a write back edit. So the partial reload is all about optimizing that workflow every time someone enters and saves some edits. So the second piece here is we've loaded our QVD into memory, and then during a partial reload, we want to go and look at the QVX file. So remember, we've just made an edit, we've hit save, it's stored those 4 new rows into the QVX. We want to go and grab those 4 rows, and we want to append them to our our existing master file. So now we have our previous set of records. We've got these 4 new alternative version records that we've appended on the bottom. And then this is kind of our final table that we're holding in memory. And so we're just doing a resident load here because we're doing some other little bits of cleanup. Like after these latest versions or these latest edits have been added, we're coming back in here and doing things like recalculating this weighted amount, things like that. We're recalculating this days to close field. We're doing uh, a bit of cleanup of some of these values. This is not really a necessary step in all use cases, but because the data set I'm dealing with here is quite small, it only takes maybe 1 second to do this resident load. So it's for simplicity, it works quite well in this use case. So just to run through that workflow again, um, the first thing we're doing here is grabbing the master file, the latest version of that master file. We're concatenating in our latest set of edits from the QVX file. And then here's our sort of final table that we're going to hold in memory. Now, there's a couple of other things we're doing in here. We've introduced this step here where what we're doing is you can imagine that we've just made some edits to an opportunity. And so once we get to the end of this stage here, we might have an opportunity ID that now has 2 rows held in memory. And when we come to present that data in the front end, um, we need to know for various reasons, we need to know what is the latest version of that record. So in the table at the bottom here, I don't want to show, I might have 10 different scenarios that I've modeled for this particular opportunity. I don't want to see those 10 scenarios in this particular table. All I'm interested at the moment is what is the latest scenario we have for this opportunity. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a flag just based on the timestamp in these, against the opportunity IDs. We're creating a flag of 1 to indicate the latest record. And then in our final table, we still have multiple rows for that op ID, but now we have this latest op ID record. And what it means is that in the front end, we can go and leverage that flag. So, in our bar chart here, as an example, we'll be leveraging that flag here in our set analysis. We're doing the same thing in the table here, but most importantly, in the writeback extension itself, when we come up to our opportunity ID, what we're saying is only show us the latest record for that op ID. So, and the reason for that is, I want to see the latest set of records for opportunity 10427. And then if I want to go and edit this again, I don't really care about what the previous 9 versions were. All I want to do is go and make a small update to the current version of this record. So that setting up that flag is really important, and in almost all use cases, it's going to be really helpful to have this latest opportunity flag in your table. Another reason why this flag's going to be really important is in this particular use case, I'm not really doing anything here to present the historical edits. even though I'm actually holding them in memory. So I might have 10 different versions over 2 months for this one op ID. I'm not actually presenting those anywhere in this dashboard, but maybe a requirement surfaces where someone says, hey, we need an audit trail. And I actually want to see all 10 uh, scenario versions that have ever been created for that op ID. Well, I could easily go and present that data in another table and just use this flag here to sort of section off that subset of historical records versus the latest edit. Something else in the script that's important to note, and this is actually the very first step in our script, is that you can imagine this is our data model that we have held in memory. And every time we go and make a write back edit, what we actually want to do in our use case is we want to drop the sales opportunities table entirely and we want to rebuild it. And so that is why at the very start here, we have this if statement that's saying if this is a partial reload that's being executed, then drop this table from memory. So that's our final table here that we create. Drop that from memory and then carry on. And then so what we end up doing is because we have an add prefixed on this load statement and the same here, we essentially go through these steps and rebuild the sales opportunities table from scratch. So you'll notice all of these load statements have an add prefix, which means they are getting executed on a partial reload. Now, this workflow is appropriate in this use case only because the sales opportunities table is tiny. You know, it has 1,000 rows. Maybe it could have 10,000 rows, but um, it's a lot simpler and easier for us to just drop this entire thing from memory and rebuild it from scratch, as opposed to trying to like incrementally update that table. Now, there are there's some good documentation around Qlik's partial reload functions. So there is an add and replace function, and then there's also an only keyword that you can use in there as well. And what the only keyword is going to do is say only execute this particular piece of script on a partial reload, for example, and not on a full load. So what you can do is kind of use a combination of add, replace, and only, and the is partial reload function to create a workflow that works for your particular use case. Now, a couple of other sort of tricks that can help out as you build out your use case. Um, so one of the key things to this whole process is getting the partial reload script correct. Now, if you kind of follow this type of process, not to the letter, but the idea that uh, we drop whatever existing data from memory that's no longer relevant because we need to rebuild it. We grab the latest master file of records. We add whatever the latest edits were. We create some kind of flag or indicator to identify which are the latest records versus which are historical records, and then some kind of final step that either is used to clean up data, create new calculated fields that use the latest edits, or in some use cases, you might even want a function here where we actually only keep the latest edits and we ditch all of the historical records. You know, your use case might have have some justification for doing that. But essentially, this last step here is where you're going to decide what to keep in memory, how to organize it, how to flag historical versus new records, and so on. Now, in order to test your partial reload script, what you can do is you can head out to your hub and find your application that you're working in. And if you go to schedule reload, what you can do is turn this on just to execute once, and you can say you want it to execute as a partial reload. And this is a good way of testing your partial reload script. Um, So you can run that once, and then you can come into details. You can go to your reload history, and then you can go and grab the log file. So if you were testing your partial reload script, you had a script error or a failure, you can then use the log file here to try and diagnose why that script might have failed. So this is a good trick to kind of work through testing your partial reload script. From within the script editor, um, there's no ability in here to actually kick off a partial reload. A couple of other things to watch out for. So partial reloads are a piece of the Qlik process that not many users have worked with before, and there's a few things that can catch you out. Um, One is around mapping loads. So you can imagine if I had a section in here that had a series of mapping loads. And so maybe in here I've created some kind of mapping table. And then what I'm doing, you know, somewhere in here is I might actually have an apply map function that calls on, my mapping, and maybe I'm mapping something, onto the account name, like this. Now, when Qlik goes to read this statement here, it needs to be able to find this mapping in memory. And so what you'll often find is that you also, when you create your mapping load, you need to add an add prefix to the load statement so that that mapping load is also created during a partial reload. Um, Something to watch out for here is that um, even if the apply map is not in one of the tables that gets loaded during a partial reload. So we talked earlier about a scenario where you might have a transactions table here that has a lot of data in it. If you have an apply map that's in that piece of load script that generates the transactions table, um, you Qlik will also or uh, Qlik will also fail in the script there if it can't find the mapping that's being called, even though you're not actually trying to execute that mapping as part of your partial reload. So that's something to watch out for, is making sure that there's really two solutions to that. Either you make sure that all of your mapping tables get loaded as part of the partial reload process, or and this is, imagine you have lots of mapping tables and it takes a long time to load those into memory. You might want to circumnavigate those completely. So another way of doing this is you can use an if is partial reload function like this to actually section off part of the script that runs on a partial reload and kind of ignore everything else in your script. So imagine you had 10 different pages of script in here. What you might do at the very beginning is say, like, if not is partial reload, then go through and load these 10 tabs and then get to a certain point where it says end if. Um, and then and then say if is partial reload, then go and do the stuff here. Um, so yeah, a couple of things to watch out for with partial reloads. So that's pretty much our use case. There are a range of materials at writeback.pomerolpartners.com. We've got installation steps in here. We've got some example load scripts. Just be aware that there's content in here that relates to Qlik SaaS as well as Qlik Enterprise on-prem, and the extension and the governance around the extension and so on works very differently in those two environments. Um, so just be aware of whether the materials are specifically talking about SaaS versus on-prem. So there's some pieces in here like the PMC settings. This is the Pomerol Management Console. This is something that only applies to the Qlik Enterprise on-prem version. The SaaS version is significantly simpler and relies on the governance that's actually built into that platform as opposed to having its own security and governance. Um, There's some good use case videos in here where we walk through some different types of use cases. So check these out for some ideas on other use cases of how you could use the Writeback extension.